I was an Army officer. I was a psychological operations analyst, counterterrorism. I had a top secret clearance. I was in the Bush administration from 2003 to 2008. I worked at the State Department as a counterterrorism analyst. I was at Special Operations Command. I was at U.S. Central Command. I got a direct commission as an Army officer. I had advanced degrees, a PhD, a master's, and a bachelor's, and I spoke Spanish fluently. So I lived all my life in California, and I went out to Washington, D.C. in 1998 to go to fight against the Clinton administration. I thought they were doing some things I found immoral and bad, so I packed a bag and I went out to Washington, D.C. in 1998 and started going into the Republican political sector because I thought they were conservative, and I thought they represented conservative values and things like that. So I worked out in the Bush administration from 2003 to 2008, and then I got pulled into Booz Allen Hamilton. How many are familiar with Booz Allen Hamilton? Booz Allen Hamilton is a defense contractor that has contracts all over the world in the military and in the intelligence community. CIA, NSA, National Reconnaissance Office, all the major branches of the military. And they do everything under the sun. They started back in the 1940s, setting up the IRS and a bunch of other federal agencies. They're also responsible for developing Homeland Security. So I got pulled into the Booz Allen Hamilton shop by a guy named Colonel Jeff Jones, who was a 4th Psychological Operations Command commander. He was an old school John Wayne, best and brightest of what we had in the military. I say had in the military because he's passed and there's no one that matches him. And I remember going to a Pentagon briefing in which I stood up and challenged Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and General Myers. And I said, sir, what are we doing in the psychological operations community? What are we doing in psychological warfare? My background had been in advertising, and I did a lot of study into the Islamic mind, Islamic counterterrorism, jihad. I knew everything there was to know on the Sunnah, the Hadiths, the life of Muhammad, the Quran. And I was working in the Bush administration at the time. And I was working with joint interagencies and how they were attacking the menace of, quote, September 11th, which I came to discover much later was not the narrative that I thought it was. But I'll leave that aside for right now. But Myers and Rumsfeld had said, well, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're failing, and we need better and brighter people to join the team. So why don't you join? Why don't you join the military? And shortly after that, I got a call from Colonel Jeff Jones and said, I like what you said. I'm looking to assemble a team of people. I want you to join it. So I left the Bush administration and joined Colonel Jones's team in Booz Allen Hamilton, and I embarked on my military career. I was given a direct commission. I went through Army training, and I saw things, and nothing I ever talk about is classified. I take my oath as an officer and as someone who's sworn to top secret SCI material very seriously, and I never discussed anything that was TSSCI or anything that could be classified. So I then embarked on a journey with Booz Allen Hamilton, and I worked at the State Department and did counterterrorism work, Special Operations Command. I worked joint interagencies, Pentagon, and I was soon after tapped to go into counterterrorism threat finance. Now that was the job tracking money supplies, tracking terrorists and their banks and their couriers and their networks, and everything that bad guys use to fund their operations against U.S. military personnel. And I was taken down to U.S. Central Command at MacDill Air Force Base, Florida. MacDill is a joint base. You've got special operations. You've got all sorts of operations, SEALs and Green Berets and everything down there. And I went down and started doing a lot of work. And my boss was a guy named Dov Zakheim. How many have heard of Dov Zakheim? Dov Zakheim was the comptroller. You can Google a lot of this stuff in YouTube and what have you. Dov Zakheim was the comptroller at the Pentagon where $2.3 trillion went missing. He's all wrapped up in a lot of the YouTube presentations on the 9/11 shenanigans and all the cover-up and who was really responsible. He's Rabbi Dov Zakheim, by the way. He's got dual citizenship in Israel. And his son is a guy named Roger Zakheim. And Roger Zakheim worked with him and worked at the Pentagon too. He also later went to the House Armed Services Committee. And then he's went to a law firm called Covington and Burling. Covington and Burling will be brought in soon. And I'm starting to mention a lot of these parties, and a lot of it, you know, I'll flip on the web. Actually, I think I can do it here. There we go. This is sort of the matrix of the whole operation. Dov Zakheim hired me, took me down to U.S. Central Command, and I started doing tracking money supplies. I started discovering a lot of contractor fraud, a lot of funny business that was going on with Booz Allen Hamilton and our military. Of course, I was wearing a dual hat. I was a contractor and a military officer, so I had military guys calling me from Iraq looking for support, and I was trying to provide it. I was trying to provide the best services, intel, and everything that we could to keep guys alive, because I thought we were in war. I wasn't looking at it like a contract. I wasn't looking at it like a job. I was looking at it like, you know what? I went and joined the military and joined Booz Allen to serve my country and finish a war that I was told other guys started. But that came to be changed a lot later when I discovered other guys didn't start it. We kind of started it ourselves. But in making a lot of reports and a lot of briefings, I was soon after told to shut up and be quiet and not make noise, and we weren't going to be doing anything new, despite how valuable it was going to be to our guys. And I'll make a long story short, I remember stopping at the gate at MacDill Air Force Base, and I was stopped by military police, and they ordered me out of my car and at gunpoint. Now, I thought this was an operation. I was destined to be deployed. I was going to go overseas. I had a top secret clearance. I was told you're going to be tested, you're going to be stopped, you're going to go through operations to determine, you know, your muster, because you're going to go over to bad guys' land and you may get kidnapped and all that stuff. So I honestly thought I was being part of an operational training module, and the MPs ordered me out of my car. Of course, I asserted all the constitutional rights that KrisAnne Hall so brilliantly articulated, and I was still ordered out of my car at the point of AR-15s. So I got out of my car and I sat, and again, I thought it was a test, and next thing I know, the MPs hold me for 40 minutes outside the base and then order the Tampa police to come and pick me up, and it was a SEAL at Tampa Police Department. They took me back to Tampa Police Department and said, okay, we're going to put you through a DUI program, and I thought, okay, this is part of their operation, and then released me like 8 hours later. All the time I'm thinking this is part of an operation. I drive back to base, I'm ordered out of my car a second time, and I go through the same model. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to turn around and leave. No, you're not. You're going to get out right now. When someone's pointing a gun at you, you do what they say, especially when you know in Iraq, guys coming to cross points get shot up very quickly. So I get out of the car, I go into base, and I go through like 12 hours of interrogation. And of course I don't answer anything, and I'm put into a hot car with the windows rolled up in Tampa, which is quite abrasive. And then I'm put into a cell with my hands behind my back, quite levitated above a chair. I felt like John McCain in his Vietnam experience. And I was then released with a little ticket saying I was barred from base. And then the next day I was fired from Booz Allen Hamilton, at which point I recognized this was all a setup. There was something afoot. And I then was told to clear out and go back to Washington, D.C. and go back to my Army unit, which I did. And I then called the military and I said, I think there's a misunderstanding. They're telling me my housing form. They came up to me actually and said, your housing form isn't properly filled out, and you've got your guns on base and you haven't got them registered yet. I had a gun safe that had just come on. You want to fix it? Thank you. Yeah, it's killing me. So they try to say, well, your housing form you filled out wrong, and your guns were brought on base and they weren't registered. And I said, well, that was my Battalion S1 doing all the transfer. I was transferring down from Washington, D.C. to MacDill, and I just transferred my guns. I had a gun safe. I had a AK-47, a shotgun, and a few pistols and such. I think everybody in this room probably has. And they were all locked up, and they were mine. They were registered. But anyway, they made this charge, and I had an attorney contact me. His name was David Shalala. How many of you know Donna Shalala? That's her nephew. And he said to me, I'm politically connected. I'll make a lot of this go away. It's a big misunderstanding. And I'm thinking it's part of an operation anyway, so I go with the flow. And I go back to my military base, or my military battalion. And here's when they start. Obama had been elected. This is 2010. of summer of 2010. And they were going about trying to introduce Don't Ask, Don't Tell's reversal in the military, where they introduced homosexuality in the military. And I had worked at psychological operations, and I knew everything about the Islamic culture, mind, and the jihadis. And I wrote a report and sent it up to the White House, the Pentagon, John Boehner, and my command at U.S. Civil Affairs Psychological Operations Command. And I said, if we change this policy, we're basically going to be inflaming the radical Muslim world to recruit new suicide bombers, and our troops are going to be hurt, and it's not a wise policy to change at this point. Well, 1 month after I submitted that report, I was indicted by the Department of Justice. And that indictment said I had made a false statement on a housing form by circling 3 buttons, and my orders hadn't yet been cut. So they said, because your orders hadn't been cut, technically these circles that you filled out were false, so that's a false statement. And they also said you had guns on base that hadn't yet been registered, so you violated this. And you wore your uniform without authorization. And I thought, how can a civil justice department tell me, an Army officer, that I've worn my uniform? You're not in charge of the military's in charge of the military. Article, I think it was Section 8, or Article 1, Section 8, the military shall do all administrative issues. The military never charged me with anything. The military never even cited me with anything. This was all Obama's Holder Justice Department. And in hearing some of KrisAnne's presentations on the usurpation of power, I was the first to fall in this whole Boston Tea Party shot. I was the black guy that she mentioned who came out, and they took me out. They took me down. They charged me with these 3 things. And again, I'm thinking, is this a setup? This has got to be crazy, because there's no way they can get away with this. I've never been in trouble. I mean, I'm an Army officer with a top secret clearance and worked at the highest levels of counterterrorism. Nah, they got to be doing this for ulterior motives. And I go down to Florida and expecting all this to be thrown out, motion to suppress, and the law. I'll tell you one thing about lawyers, present company excluded. They are some of the uncreative dullards you'll ever encounter in life. They don't know how to think. They're not creative. They're systematic people. They think in blocks, as Charlie Brown's blockhead appropriately applies to them. And the lawyers, I'm not. Again, the biggest thing about my story, my experience, is God was present in everything that happened to me. God was present, and He was taking me through a process and a place and pounding character into me like an anvil against steel, and was really burning out a lot of the dross. And I was going through an incredible transformation. And I go down to Florida, and I expected all this to be thrown out. None of my documents that I had given my lawyer, David Shalala, he put into the court record. And these are documents establishing who I was with the military, the work I was doing, the top secret clearance, and everything like that. Instead, he kept all of that out. He didn't put me on the stand as I requested. He didn't meet with me until the day of trial. He was supposed to meet with me a week prior. I show up to the courtroom, and he's, oh, yeah, I was busy. Well, this is my life. And I go into court for the next 4 days. I hear this Obama Justice Department federal prosecutor in a federal court, not state. So they violated the laws of Florida. They violated the laws of the civilian population because they took an issue that occurred on Florida land and made it a federal issue. And I wasn't on federal land. So there's a lot of intricacies and legalities involved with this case that lawyers are starting to contact me about and say, well, did they do this? Did they do that? How come you didn't do this? Hey, welcome to my world. I should have done, if I knew then what I knew now, I would have been a gunslinger in the courtroom with words, and no one would have walked out of there except me. But I had to go through that whole process in order to learn the skills and learn the knowledge. And what KrisAnne was talking about is beautiful. It's perfect, because that material can empower you and how to react and what to know. So I go down to court, and I go through this whole monkey trial, and the next thing I know, this is the other funny thing, the prosecutor tried to introduce evidence saying I had dressed up in a police uniform at Fort Myer up in Washington, D.C., which was complete baloney and a lie, but they got it from a Wackenhut security guard. Wackenhut is a CIA operation. So the CIA were coming after me, and I thought, wow, this is pretty cool. I'm pretty high on the hog if someone's pissed off list. And they throw that out at the judge at the beginning of trial to make me look like a crazy guy. And then at the end of the trial, the judge says, well, wait a minute, you had something about him dressing up as a police uniform. And I had an attorney in Washington, D.C. who got a private investigator who did the investigation. They said, no, it wasn't me, and they're making this up. Get the cameras, get everything. You'll find that out. They retracted it at the last minute. The prosecutor, her name was Sarah Sweeney, and her chief, master was a guy named O'Neill. O'Neill prosecuted a guy named Brad Birkenfeld and Swiss bankers and all the shenanigans with UBS and these other banks that I'll come to later. But she retracted that and said, oh, we're having trouble with our witness. But she had already thrown the big pot of spaghetti against the wall. And the judge said, all right, well, and the civilian jury didn't know anything about military procedure, and they just thought, again, the trauma of the Patriot Act and all the stuff that has happened, they thought, this guy's done something. We don't know what, and we're just going to vote him guilty. So a civilian trial voted me guilty of making a false statement on a housing form, wearing my uniform, and having guns unregistered. Now, I thought I was going to have an appeal. I thought I was going to have military lawyers step in. I was going to fire these attorneys and get some new ones. Well, that was all fine in fantasy world, but the reality is they put a big cane around my neck and yanked me into prison. And they put me into a prison for 6 months, and it was quite a hellacious experience. But again, I looked at it like an Army guy. This is Army training. I'm going to be like in a bamboo cage. I'm going to muster down. Plus, God's leading me for a reason. In the Pharaoh's prison or Jonah and the whale. There's all sorts of analogies. But, we as Christians, we're called to suffer. We're called to fight. We're called not to live a luxury life full of cotton candy and watching The Simpsons and taking alcohol and all that stuff. We're called to be the light and the salt for the other people to see and glow. So I found the prison, to be a ministry, and I was devastated because what it did to my family, because they were traumatized. They thought I was getting raped in the prison and all this stuff. I kept saying, no, nothing's happening. This is all going to work its way out. And the parents and all that, well, I don't know what's going on. And it was traumatic because the media wrote all these lies and nonsense. He's an imposter. He's trying to bring guns on the base. He's going to possibly shoot it up and all this stuff. Well, they pulled me in front of sentencing, and the judge says, make a long story short, instead of 0 to 7 months, which was my guidelines for this thing, they gave me 36 months, an enhancement. And they gave me an enhancement because my guns had brought on a base, and they illegally perverted the law by saying, because he got on a base and he had guns, we're going to give him a gun enhancement, like I had robbed a bank using a gun or done anything using a gun. So they gave me a gun enhancement. Now, the significance of this story is what they've done to me, they can do to you. They can do to your kids. This isn't about me. This isn't about anything that I went through. This is about you. This is about you all using, and the reason I wanted to give you out cards, and I want you to keep these, and if you need more, call me, contact me. I'll give you some. I want you to use this story, this card, as your concrete application, your tool, your experience. This can be your entryway to engage politicians and military people and political people and say, hey, Senator Feinstein, we're all from California here, and I'm from California, so I'm just going to focus on California. You can go up to Senator Feinstein. You can go up to any member of Congress and say, hey, you see this? Yeah. And I was a PSYOP guy, so I know the thing about imagery and symbolism and talisman and all that other stuff. You can show them this and say, this is a story that a soldier, his rights and my rights were violated. His rights as a soldier, his rights as a civilian. My kid serves, or my husband serves, or I served, or whatever. You need to investigate this, and I'm holding you to task. This is a concrete thing. This isn't theory, as beautiful as theory is, and we need to learn the law, and we need to learn application. This is a concrete thing that happened, and it's still happening because it's still in the courts. I'm going back to Florida in the next 30 to 60 days, like Goliath, Goliath going back into, not Goliath, I'm sorry, he was a strong man. Samson, thank you very much. Samson going back into the pillars, and I'm going to push him down, and hopefully I'll survive the event, but I'm going back into a court of Florida law to say all of this was a violation of my constitutional rights. And you violate every American's rights by doing to me what you did. A gross perversion of justice, a perversion of the law. You violated the Uniform Code of Military Justice by attacking me. Only the military can, and on and on and on. But that's a long story of where it is legally. But this can be a weapon for all of you to use. And that's what we're here for, is to gain the experience and the knowledge to be powerful. So you can go, and I just did this with Catherine Baker in California. I stood up and said, hey, I'm a military officer. I wrote a report exposing terrorist financing going to bad guys, and I sent it to 150 to 200 members of Congress and the Senate and the military. No one did anything. I'm giving it to you and I expect you within a week to report back what you're doing on it. Well, I'll have to look at the jurisdiction. Yeah, you keep looking, but I'm going to be here and you're going to give me an answer. All of you can do the same thing. So live through this experience and use it to your advantage to protect yourself, protect your kids. So that's what this can do. And anybody who looks at it will go, is this real? Was this fiction? Was this made up? This is real. This is how God works. He uses the foolish things to confound the wise. He has put me in a position that no one in the country has been put. I was a military officer, I was a contractor, I was in the Bush administration, I was the highest levels of command, but of course I was a Christian. So God had his hand on me. He was putting me there for a reason. So I get prosecuted, I get given my sentence, and they're going to whip me out to California. And of course I'm appealing, I fired my attorneys, I start writing the military, doing everything I can to have this thing reviewed. I thought I was going to get out to form an appeal. And they put me on a bus and they shipped me out to Oklahoma to go to California. Well, that's where God's first hand, or second time, he puts his hand in and redirects me. He redirects me to Pennsylvania instead of California. And I go up to Pennsylvania. And that's where the story takes a turn to the miraculous. I meet a Swiss banker named Brad Birkenfeld. Brad Birkenfeld was a Swiss banker who came over from Switzerland in 2007, 2008, and had 22,000 bank accounts at Union Bank of Switzerland, HSBC, Liechtenstein, Credit Suisse. He was the banker of bankers. He was a smart guy. He was seasoned. He was a civilian, and I don't think he was Christian, but he had been in key positions. He fled and came over to the United States after the CIA had targeted him and put him into a DUI situation to try and get economic espionage information. He packed his bags and came over to the U.S. Edward Snowden was part of that operation. Edward Snowden was a CIA asset at the time, and he had reported that to Glenn Greenwald. If you Google the Glenn Greenwald story, you will see Snowden's revelation of him being in the CIA and them targeting a Swiss banker. That was Brad Birkenfeld. You'll never hear this in the mainstream media. You'll never hear this by the politicians, but that's where you got them by the short hairs, because all this stuff begins to assemble into one nexus, and I'm at the center of the web, and I'm not going away, and I'm telling you the story, and it's all verifiable in documents. So Brad Birkenfeld had come over. He had given his 22,000 bank accounts, had asked for subpoenas. The Justice Department kicked him out, didn't want anything to do with him. He goes to the IRS, the SEC, they don't want him. He finally gets a Senate hearing with Senator Carl Levin and McCain, and then Senator Barack Obama. And he gives all this material. Next thing you know, they prosecute him with what he said. And another interesting thing happened. When he came over, a letter, he had a banker friend of his named Mohammed something who lived in London. He was very wealthy. And he called Brad and said, hey, I'm going to Mexico. I'm going to pick you up in my private plane. Oh, great, I'm in the U.S. Picks up Brad, goes to Mexico. A letter shows up at UBS headquarters, supposedly written by this friend of Brad's. The guy never wrote it. So CIA or NSA, in working in conjunction with the Department of Justice, fabricated a false letter, pretending to be written by his friend, in the hopes of getting him killed or arrested or something. And that came out when UBS got this letter, and it wasn't signed by his friend. It was just dated July 2007 or something. And they said, why did you send us a letter? And the guy said, I never sent you a letter. Send it to me. He sent it to him. He sent it to Brad. Brad went to the Department of Justice. Said, what the hell is this? Oh, we'll get back to you. They never did. Next thing you know, they prosecute him, throw him in jail for 40 months. That's where he met me. Was at Pennsylvania. And over six, I couldn't believe it. I knew I was there for a reason. I know he was doing something. And I was on mission. I was fighting in the Army and the defense contracting, trying to find bad guys and their money supplies. Trying to find out where the Swiss bank accounts were. Swiss bank accounts are invisible. You'll never find them. And here I go to prison in Pennsylvania, and I run into Brad Birkenfeld, the Swiss banker with 22,000 bank accounts. And I think, God is great. He is powerful. If anything, this could go to anybody who's an unbeliever and say, this was not an accident, it wasn't a planned operation. He was in charge of this, and this is just snowballing now. Brad and I sat down for 6 months, went over every document he had. It even had WikiLeaks cables sent into him. One thing about the federal prison system, we were at a camp, right? A camp, country club. It was just like a college campus, really. And you had stockbrokers, doctors, lawyers, people that were there. For a lot of them were set up. I mean, if you knew half the truth about how easy it is to be thrown in a prison, especially when you have family and stuff, and the Justice Department says, hey, you better plea or else we're going to put you in for 20 years. If you've got a family and kids, all right, I'm going to take a plea and be out in a year and a day. Most guys do that. The sad thing for you is that establishes the precedent, and the island shrinks a little bit more. And now the Justice Department can come to you and do the same thing. But Brad and I went over 6 months and saw all of his documents and compared everything. I said, Brad, are you telling me not one time did anybody in a uniform come and get this from you? And he said, not once, not ever did anybody in the military or the intelligence community debrief me. I said, well, that's my job. I was on the trail of bad guys and their money. You're the goose that laid the golden egg, so let's start writing all this up and send it to the military channels. Because I was still a military officer in prison. I had not been discharged. I was still a military officer. And some people like Susan Lindauer and Barbara Honegger and people that I've met in the 9/11 issue much later when I came out have said, Scott, you were set up. You were sent in there to find this information. I said, well, God may have done it, and maybe he used men to articulate it. But they're convinced that I was sent in to get Brad Birkenfeld and get his material. Because shortly after that, we assembled a report. We sent it up to General James Mattis at U.S. Central Command. And Brad said, sir, I am Brad Birkenfeld. I'm the Swiss banker. I've got 22,000 bank accounts, none of which were shared with you. They all articulate terrorist financing sources. And I know this for a fact because Booz Allen Hamilton is contracted to do that. And I know Scott Bennett was a contractor, and he never got this information. Please debrief me. We sent that up to U.S. Central Command. 30 or 60 days later, after James Mattis started asking questions, he was fired by Obama. And then all the rats started jumping ship from the Obama administration. It was a long sink. But Brad then got out of prison, and 1 month later, on September 11th, 2012, he was paid off $104 million, and he went completely silent, probably because they threatened him with lead, not just gold. And on that same day, what else happened?
You got out.
No. Benghazi occurred. And everyone in the intelligence community has said Benghazi was done simultaneously with this $104 million payoff. And you can go to the website and you can see the actual briefing that Brad's lawyers gave on September 11, 2012. And you can match it with the Benghazi attacks. Now, the other significant thing is, on the Benghazi, that same day, you had a lot of money exchanges between the Benghazi, which now has come out with Larry Claim or Judicial Watch's FOIA. You see a lot of the legal documents that came out on that day, which articulate that Benghazi was not an Egyptian filmmaker issue. It was bad guys that we were employing that were coming in from various sources to usurp and destabilize and kick out of power Muammar Gaddafi. And they were being funded through a lot of Swiss banks and European banks and other banks. But we were funding bad guys, and that came out in the FOIA that Judicial Watch came, and it came from the Defense Intelligence Agency. So the Defense Intelligence Agency wrote a report that said bad guys did this, not an Egyptian filmmaker, and bad guys that are supported by Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, which are basically make up the Wahhabist, Salafist powers. So we knew back in those days, September 11th, 2012, that this was something much more. And it's just coming out now. So Hillary Clinton, when she gets up and gives all her lies, well, we know the horse is the same color. So that came out. What happened immediately when Brad was released and he was paid off, I didn't drop the ball and I didn't stop. Although I was in prison, I started writing whistleblowing reports up to the military. As an officer sworn to uphold the Constitution, as an officer entrusted by the men under me to protect them with the best knowledge that I knew how, I started filing reports to 150, 200 members of Congress. And I started in the military command system. I wrote it up to General Jeff Jacobs, who was my commander at U.S. Civil Affairs Psychological Operations Command, his assistant, Lieutenant Colonel Bauckham Folk, Fort Bragg, and then I started following up to Martin Dempsey, General Martin Dempsey, General Ray Odierno, the Pentagon Inspector General, Lynn Halbrook, and then I went on to all the committees, the Armed Services Committee, House and Senate, the Judiciary Committee, the Foreign Relations Committee, the Homeland Security Committee, and Peter King and Howard Buck McKeon, and of course Senator Dianne Feinstein and Senator Barbara Boxer and John Boehner, and the list is lengthy. And not one of them ever responded. Now, mind you, I'm not a milkman. I'm not a car mechanic coming saying, hey, I have a theory. I am an officer of the United States Army in prison with a top secret clearance, and I've got the credentials from State Department, SOCOM, everywhere. So if anybody knows this business, it's me, because that's what I did for a living. No one responded. No one asked for questions. No one asked for a debriefing, and they just let it sit. And for the next 2 years, I wrote at a typewriter, like Snoopy on the Charlie Brown cartoon comic. I'm typing letters and sending them off to every congressman and senator and military person I can, pleading for this information. And then, you know, all the Benghazi and all this stuff started rolling out. Well, what was interesting is Edward Snowden got wind of the reports that were going out in December, or probably November. And soon after that, we all know he packed his bags and fled over to Russia and trying to get to Cuba, and they stopped, or to Ecuador, and they stopped him. So Snowden was significant because he was part of Brad Birkenfeld's operation in Geneva, Switzerland. He was also a Booz Allen Hamilton contractor with the people that I worked with at Hawaii in NSA surveillance operations. So Snowden saw our reports, recognized Birkenfeld, recognized me, packed his bag, and fled. No one will ever report that. There's some other figures that are connected with this, like Jesselyn Radack. Jesselyn Radack represents Snowden now. She also represented Brad Birkenfeld, the Swiss banker. And her and a lot of these government accountability projects and these nonprofits in Washington that proclaim to be whistleblowing organizations, they've never responded to any of this. So there's a lot more funny business involved with them. But I was filing all this up the chain of command. No one responded except one person. Can anybody guess who that one person was? Senator Rand Paul. Senator Rand Paul was the only one, and of course it was a tepid letter. It wasn't anything demonstrative. It wasn't coming over a white horse as Gandalf in Lord of the Rings. But he said, you're going to have to take this to the Pennsylvania people, and that was it. But he was the only one, which may be his only saving grace. But everyone else, including Heritage Foundation, including Family Research Council, everybody who calls themselves a conservative, no one did anything. And I also wrote this to everybody at Fox News. Of course, I'm a conservative, and I'm a Republican, and I'm, fighting on the right side of truth. I'm expecting Fox News to come riding in, draped in the flag, trying to, what happened? Why is this guy here? What's he got? I wrote Laura Ingraham, Hannity, O'Reilly, Greta Van Susteren, Chris Wallace, everybody. And I know their address by heart, 1211 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 100-1. No one at Fox News did anything, wrote a single letter, didn't investigate a single thing. So they're all basically going to have to give an account at some point, but they're all on the chopping block because they were informed. The only media that ever interviewed me was Michael Isikoff and a guy named Tom Hamburger from the Washington Post. Michael Isikoff was NBC News. And he had called and talked to a family relative of mine and said, well, what's this guy about? And my family relative had said, you better get up there and interview him or else somebody else is going to. Well, he thought, I don't want to lose the money. So they came up to Pennsylvania and interviewed me. And they thought they were going to interview a contractor that was off the reservation. If you recall, someone had shot up a Navy yard like a month or so before in Washington, D.C., and they were going to come in and say, here's another contractor who's in prison. Well, they came up and I gave them all this information. I said, I'm here illegally, I'm here unconstitutionally, I'm a military officer, I was in terrorist financing, I filed all these reports and no one's done anything. Here they are. You report them. You do something with them. And Michael Isikoff and Tom Hamburger for 2 hours are looking at me, not saying much, and they walk out, tail between their legs, sort of pale. They don't write a single word, nor do they return any of my documents, despite the numerous times I tried to get them back and wrote them. So again, all these people, everybody in the room can challenge and say, I know about this story, and I know about you, and I know about your cover-up, and what have you got to say? And they're all going to be on the defense. But it's important to use this as you remember the movie Saving Private Ryan? When the infantry breached through the breach and shot up the hill, they put a bandolier that blew up the barbed wire, and everybody could pour in through that opening. Well, this is the bandolier that blows up the opening for everybody to pour through because it's got politicians, it's got military, it's got media that have all basically violated the Constitution. And what's important is It's not about me. It's about there's money that Swiss banks have been paying to bad guys in the Middle East, ISIS now, that we've known about since 2012, and we have not shut it down. We haven't even investigated it. We haven't debriefed Bennett or Birkenfeld to say, what have you got? And how many kids are dead from 2012 that we're serving? How many kids have lost their arms, their legs? How many of your kids, perhaps, or your neighbor's kids? And if someone in here has lost a kid in 2012, 2013, I'm sorry to say that kid may be dead because the money that bought that ordinance was bought through these banks that these guys in Congress knew about in 2012 and have done nothing. So that's a treasonable offense in my book. And I can't wait until we have the opportunity to go up and accuse them of treason and do some of these colorful legal acrobatics that Kristen Hall articulates. Michael Hastings, I sent him all of my stuff, and I pointed out, here's what's going on, Hastings. McChrystal was part of my chain of command in special operations and PSYOP, and Hastings got all this material. I think it was within 2 months he was killed. Yeah. So Hastings is connected to this, and I'm not a, I certainly don't go into the conspiracy thing, but I know the facts, and I have the document material to prove it, and it's very odd and crazy that some of these things have happened. Now this is interesting too, and you can't make this up. UBS and HSBC are all known for terrorist financing. Well, they are represented by a law firm called Covington and Burling. Covington and Burling in Washington, D.C. Covington and Burling employed Eric Holder and Lanny Breuer before they went into government. They now employ them again because Lanny Breuer and Eric Holder have recently went back to Covington and Burling. So it's important because they prosecuted Birkenfeld, the Swiss banker, who came to them and said, I've got all this terrorist financing information, money laundering information, Lanny Breuer and Eric Holder working with Hillary Clinton, because Brad showed me State Department cables, and I said, Brad, I was at the State Department when these cables were written. I was in the middle of it. So Lanny Breuer and Eric Holder and Hillary Clinton, in her power as Secretary of State, conspired to prosecute Birkenfeld, hide his information, and threw him in jail. Then Lanny Breuer and Eric Holder went back to Covington and Burling, so they're still representing Union Bank of Switzerland and HSBC. Talk about a conflict of interest. Another interesting thing was Roger Zakheim, the son of Dov Zakheim. Dov Zakheim, my boss at Booz Allen Hamilton. Dov Zakheim, the $2.3 trillion comptroller. His son, Roger Zakheim, was at the House Armed Services Committee as general counsel when my reports were going up to the Armed Services Committee, exposing his dad, exposing Swiss banks, exposing Booz Allen Hamilton, exposing this whole drama, hoping that someone was going to wear the Constitution and do their job. Instead, he sabotaged the reports. Nothing got up there. That's not been brought into a court of law yet, but it will be soon in Florida when I go back. And I'm bringing all of this to say, Your Honor, this is fraud on the court. There's major conspiracy that's involved. I want you to open the books on this whole thing. And it's being introduced as an ineffective assistance of counsel. That's your constitutional right. When you have an attorney that does not represent you, you get a chance to go back into court and say, had you known, had this attorney done this properly, I would never have been charged. I would never have been convicted. So that's the instrument that I'm going to use to get back into the courtroom. But Roger Zakheim sabotaged the reports, and then he went to Covington and Burling to work also. So Covington and Burling represents Roger Zakheim, Lanny Breuer, Eric Holder, and Michael Chertoff, the Secretary of previous Homeland Security, who also made those nice little airport scanners that everybody has to go through. So you've got quite a colorful group of characters that are up there right now. So that's where things kind of stand right now. Is all these cats have been herded back to Covington. Obama and McCain and all these politicians are abreast of it. Judge Napolitano on Fox News has recently started to come out and talk about the same stuff that I supplied him personally. I sent it to Napolitano 2 or 3 times when I was in prison, when I got out. I have not let this go, and I will not let this go until I am dead and then back up with my Father in heaven, because this is such a critically important battle that we need to expose and advance on, because every politician that's been touched by this, who's failed to have a hearing, who's failed to investigate this, is culpable. culpable for treason. Recently, we have, and I've done a lot of interviews on various radio shows and internet media, Caravan to Midnight, John Wells, Kathy Rubio, and others, and I've told the story. One of the most useful things that I've done that everyone in this room can do, and that is you get Skype capability on your computer, and you call these members of Congress, and you say, "Member of Congress, I'm calling on behalf of myself. I know a report about an Army officer who exposed terrorist financing that's been killing our soldiers. What have you done about it?" And I've got a couple books up here. One is Shell Game, and that's the whole story, and it lists all the senators and all that, and everybody I outreach to, and lists the whole story of Birkenfeld and myself. The other book is Exhibits, and that's a book about 2 inches thick of every letter that was ever sent to a member of Congress or the media. So you've got all sorts of people, senators and congressmen, who are included. The letters that went to them that said this is connected to Benghazi, this is connected to Swiss banks, this is connected to the Hillary Clinton Foundation, who's now run by Donna Shalala. So Donna Shalala, who heads up the Clinton Foundation, that's getting money from a lot of these Sunni Salafist country banks, Donna Shalala's nephew represented me. In an interesting story, this David Shalala, all this is starting to break. I mean, the whole thaw is like a river that's starting to pour through, because this guy, David Shalala, called the U.S. Probation Office like a month ago and tried to say that I had created websites pretending to be him, as if I had done identity theft or something. And the probation officer said, "I got this weird call from this guy." I said, "That's an absolute lie. They are all panicking because this is going back into a courtroom." But I say that to share with you the depth of the fear and the depravity and the lies that are behind these people in these areas of power. David Shalala, Donna Shalala, Hillary Clinton, Lanny Brewer, Eric Holder, McCasey, who was the prior Attorney General, and in the military. It saddens me to say that we've got military officers, and that was the biggest letdown of all, that I didn't have military officers jump in and say, Bennett belongs to us, you can't prosecute him. Bennett's found stuff that we need because it's killing our soldiers. No one in the military stood up and did anything. The last time I talked to Yusa Kapok at Fort Bragg, Lieutenant Colonel Bauckham Folk, when I'm talking, saying, "Sir, I just got out of prison and I've got all this material. No one's done anything. Can you do something?" Clank. He hung up on me. So it's treasonable, and if you've had kids that have been hurt and killed, this is how serious this is. It warrants a lot of reevaluation and contacting these people. But as I got out of prison, I started hitting the ground again and sending out letters and doing Skype calls and recording the calls, and I've uploaded everything onto the YouTube channel so you can actually see the calls that I made, and the script is there that you can use to make your own inquiries. And the key is using this as an offensive operation, as something that you have a duty to articulate and challenge to your member of Congress, because you've been grieved, you've been injured, you have been wounded, you have been hit in the eye. What are you going to do about it? I hope you will stand up and say, "I will not be hit in the eye. You did this to this guy, and you did it to me. You did it to my kids. You did it to my future, and I'm not going to tolerate it." What have you got to say, Senator Feinstein? What have you got to say, Howard Buck McKeon? I don't care if you're out of Congress. I don't care if you're not a committee person. You were when this went out in September 25th, 2012. And how much blood has been spilt from September 25th, 2012 to now? That's the price that they need to pay with their own political skins. And I hope you will be strong enough to go and skin them for us. I'll end by simply saying, this is something that I hope you will review and take up and see where you can apply it. It's meant to be a tool for you to use. This is an operation for us to really kind of take back our country and challenge the political forces and hopefully raise up new leaders. Everyone in this room, you have an opportunity to go back to your churches, create a ministry group. With that ministry group, then go engage the other institutions in your community, be it police, be it political, be it Chamber of Commerce, be it your schools, and build the small teams. Alexis de Tocqueville said the beauty of America is the strength of our small organizations and communities. use this as a rallying cry to build synergy and to demand accountability. And you can get all the material on the website and my contact information. I'll just go through this real quick. The interesting connection, Julian Assange of WikiLeaks supplied all this material in the WikiLeaks cables to Brad Birkenfeld. Brad Birkenfeld, of course, met me in prison. We started going through everything, and then Snowden goes over to Russia and takes off. And the connection is the Carlyle Group. That was the father company. It's connected with George W. Bush. It's the overseeing company of Booz Allen Hamilton. Ian Brzezinski, Mike McConnell, Michael Hayden, Leon Panetta, they're all Booz Allen people. Snowden and Scott Bennett were Booz Allen. Military, I worked, these are all the people at U.S. Central Command, U.S. Civil Affairs Psychological Operations Command. These are all the U.S. Congress committees, House and Senate, that I sent reports to. I spent like $1,000 on mailing stuff and letters and stamps at a typewriter, all of which are documented. Armed Services, where Roger Zakheim worked. Intelligence Committee, Homeland Security, Judiciary, all the media, Fox News people. These are the intelligence agencies that were connected with Snowden. These are the two banks, Union Bank of Switzerland and HSBC, biggest financiers of terrorism. Covington and Burling, that's the law firm in Washington that represents them. Michael Chertoff is now with them. You can't see the names here, but it's Lanny Brewer and Eric Holder. Loretta Lynch, now the Attorney General, was instrumental in the settlement with HSBC and UBS. They never prosecuted HSBC or UBS. They gave them a 2% fine and let them go their merry way. And all the bank accounts that Birkenfeld and I presented, they gave them advance warning to change. So all the money, the bank accounts, the significance is, had I met Birkenfeld and taken command of this situation, I would have shut down the bank accounts overnight. All the money that you got going to ISIS and all that, it would have been shut down. But it wasn't, and that's the treason. We've got guys that were killed, and I think Kristen Ann had a good point. Someone had been funding enemies against our Constitution, and that was a charge of treason. Obama and Clinton and Holder and Brewer have been funding our enemies through ISIS, through Al-Qaeda, to destabilize Syria, to destabilize Iran. They've already done it to Libya, against our military and contractor and Europe. This all could have been prevented, but they never did because of the loyalty of Covington and Burling to Union Bank of Switzerland, and of course Obama's questionable past and loyalties. And these are the countries: Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Yemen, Libya. Notice they're all Wahhabist, Salafist countries. It's not Iran, it's not Syria. They've tried to shift the blame to Iran and Syria, but really, quite frankly, Iran and Syria and Russia have been given an improper definition. They are the aristocrats of the Middle East. They're not the savage, beheading, boy-loving rapists that you see in the Salafist Wahhabist group. The Iranian, the Syrian regime are much more mentally and psychologically stable, and they were much more helpful to us right after September 11th. Needless to say, we've all discovered much later that September 11th was done by parties other than what was blamed. So I will leave it there and say this is real, this happened, it's a true story, it's not fiction, you couldn't make it up. God is great. He's given this as a tool to use as a crowbar and breach the opportunity and exploit the initiative.